Today we're going to be talking about security and privacy, centered around CCTV, but maybe touch on some wider issues. So I'd just like to introduce the panel today, which is Nicole Stevenson from Ground Up Consulting, Danny Story from Psychic, and Lani Refiti from IoTSec Australia. Welcome, guys. Well, I just, that's a brief introduction, but just if you're okay before we get into things, if you just say a bit more about you know, what you do and why you're here today. Nicole, start with you, please.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm Nicole Stevenson, and I am a privacy consultant based in the Brisbane area. I have 20-odd years of experience in the privacy field, which is really seen nowadays as a complementary or sister discipline to cybersecurity. So it's a real pleasure to be here and to be able to add, I guess, that additional level of depth to the discussion around security, because we're at a point where when we're talking about the data of people, it's very hard to have one without the other, right, in terms of the discussion. One thing that I think is really relevant for all of us today is that we take the time to unpack the issues as opposed to, you know, talking in sort of your sound grabby or, you know, little media level bites around issues associated with security and privacy, because this is a time, certainly, you know, in our country and in terms of regulation and what's happening around the world, where we need to actually have meaningful discussion and a level of debate on these issues, as opposed to, I guess, formulating our thoughts based on what we've heard in the media and through other sources. So thank you, Ross, so much for having me here today, and I'm looking forward to hearing from my colleagues as well.
No, thanks, Nicole. Thanks for joining us. Danny, welcome.
Thanks, Ross, and it's great to be together today to have this conversation. I think anytime we're talking about security and or privacy, I think that's always a good thing. I work with Psychic, as you mentioned, and I also work with Ion Cyber, particularly around the technology side of things. And my background is in technology architecture, and it's quite scary to me how security is often thought as an afterthought. And so I certainly think that both security and privacy should be by design and as part of a holistic process, as opposed to something that we think about just before we go live or just after we've run into some problems. So I think having this conversation is really important, but really exciting, because the more we're talking about it and the more awareness is out there, hopefully the better we can be doing in those spaces. So thank you for having me.
Yeah, thanks for joining us, Danny. And Lani, how are you?
Thanks for having me on, you know, and Lani Refiti. So I'm a cybersecurity practitioner, have been for the last 23 years, which is a while. And so I guess over the 23 years, I've got to see a lot of trends, you know, sort of come and go and stick, and have spent a lot of time in the tech space. So, you know, with tech vendors like Cisco and Intel Corporation, and more recently, more on the management consulting side of things. So, you know, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and more recently I was a partner at Deloitte, focusing in on cyber. And I guess the area that I specialize, because cyber is quite a broad domain or broad discipline, is in the IoT space, internet, more probably the industrial Internet of Things, power, water, mining, which is seeing a lot of that transformation. It's a bit cliche at the moment, but they're seeing a lot of that sort of transformation as legacy sort of equipment gets replaced, and they're looking to do things a lot more efficiently and more effectively, and adopting a lot of the IoT you know, solutions, both sensors and devices, but also the data and what they do with it, and then obviously data leading up to using that in the cloud as opposed to on site. There's very little these days data analytics being done in data centers owned by companies. A lot of it is done either in GCP, Azure, or AWS. So yeah, and I think I spoke with Anson McCade, I think it's only 3 years ago, talking about the landscape around IoT. So yeah, it's been an interesting last 3 years. A lot has changed, but a lot has stayed the same. So yeah, no, looking forward to the discussion.
Great. Well, thanks for joining us. That's probably a good point to kick off. I mean, we did. I think it was nearly 3 years ago. We spoke. We focused, I think, more on IoT in industrial. But how has the landscape changed in that time?
Yeah, look, and a good place to start. And I think, as I said, a lot has changed and a lot has stayed the same. And I think back in the day, we were really enamored with the number of sensors and the number of devices that were being deployed at the time. I think when we spoke, Gartner was forecasting something like 50 billion devices by 2020. And that was really what the focus was. And I think by most sources I looked at recently, we're up probably around the 25 to 30 billion devices rolled out. But you know, we've got the growing reach of 5G and the use of cloud, as I just mentioned, AWS and Azure, which I think will help the use cases and help us, you know, sort of scale those pilots to full-blown applications. But what has happened since, I guess, is the focus is more on the qualitative aspect. Like, what are those use cases or applications, and how is that data being used, how it's being analyzed, you know, using machine learning techniques, etc. And really, in the last 3 years, what has really become topical is data privacy. And I'm sure Nicole will speak to it. But 3 years ago, when we were speaking IoT and security, it was very rare that you'd actually talk privacy. We talked a lot about secure by design, but no one was talking, you know, privacy by design. And I think that is what has changed a lot, where the focus has gone off merely just being the devices as such. That's more almost consumerized these days. Now it's the data. How are we analyzing the data? How is it being secured? And are there any privacy you know, implications? And what we're now seeing too is a lot of the pilots that were sort of being tried out by different sectors are moving more you know, into mass deployments, sectors like manufacturing, agriculture, and it's more out of necessity than anything. Power and water are beginning to move from that sort of pilot phase into full-blown rollouts, which I think will help see that sort of mass adoption we've been expecting for a while. And then on the flip side, there's been, you know, a bit of movement around regulation. A few of the states in the US introducing sort of IoT security bills or laws, and I think the UK government is following suit as well. And then locally here in Australia, the last thing I'll touch on is that we've seen the federal government talk a lot about cybersecurity in terms of the nation's defences. And the 2020 cybersecurity strategy was just released by the government as a refresh on the original one that was done in 2016. And while there's nothing specific about IoT in there, there is a lot around critical infrastructure, and critical infrastructure are and will be great sort of use cases around IoT in terms of expanding what critical infrastructure means in terms of the law, and also committing the government to directly helping companies in the sector should they have breaches, etc.
So looking at today, I'll open this up to everyone. Where are things now? Before we go into, we'll probably dip into a couple of case studies, but where are we now in terms of risks and challenges and, you know, at a high level?
So I just raised my hand, sorry, I'm just so used to the Zoom etiquette. Yeah, it's just, I think once you've been on a few panels, there's nothing worse than interrupting each other. So sorry if I seem really, you know, schoolgirl there, but look, I think there's a couple of things happening, right? There's public perception, and then there's actually what's happening in terms of our IoT deployments, particularly in, say, that surveillance space, which is really topical at the moment. Public perception is one of those things that really needs to be carefully managed. And if you don't take your community along for the ride in terms of the deployments that you're taking on a large scale, whether it's in terms of surveillance or whether it's environmental sensing or whatever it is that you want to do with IoT, if the community is not along for the journey, they don't trust what's happening in the journey. And this is something that I'll speak to later, certainly, but you know, in terms of my work with local governments, this is something that this is a critical, almost missing piece of the puzzle. And you know, that's about privacy, certainly, but it's also about just basic respect for the community that you serve. And particularly when we're talking about governments deploying IoT, which is largely the case, right? Our local governments, our state and federal governments, for our smart cities or our critical infrastructure projects, governments really need to show a level of respect for the community in terms of what it is we want to do with their data, why, for how long. Those kinds of questions are really important. also in terms of public perception, I think there's a real risk of creating that 1984 Orwellian-like society, at least from the perspective of the community, where there's a lot of discourse, particularly among academics, around the topic of uberveillance. And there's a wonderful academic named Katina Michael, who I think is fantastic, and she and her colleagues research this idea that we're moving to a state where there's surveillance from above, right? Satellites, etc. There's surveillance from around us, so our CCTV cameras. There's surveillance on us, right? Our smartwatches or RFID tags on things that we might carry around. And then there's also surveillance in us, say in our pacemaking devices or perhaps some other kind of an implant. And that, from the perspective of the community, is quite scary. So that's your community perception and fear-based experience relating to IoT. The flip side, and certainly where I like to come in, is seeing those perceptions and those fears as a real opportunity for our governments, for our industry, even our vendor community, to get things right from the outset, to be aware of those perceptions or those fears and concentrate on building those out of the equation in terms of product design, as well as the way that those products are deployed.
Yeah. So it sounds like, from a government standpoint anyway, you said yourself, a piece missing from a policy perspective, and I think we'll probably dig into that in more detail. But Danny, from a technology standpoint, you work in this area as an architect. I mean, how do you see it from a technical perspective in terms of security and privacy? Well, perhaps we'll use a case study to go into that in more detail, but at a high level, is there a similar lack of policy, if that's the right word, or governance?
Yeah, look, I think something that, before I dive too deep into that, I think what Nicole said around, taking the community on that journey and involving them in the process, it's not always that there's actually a problem, but there can be a perception of a problem. So there's, I won't name any specifics here, but there's plenty of examples where a council's gone out and put CCTV cameras up, and there is a public perception of what they're collecting, what they're doing with that information that may or may not be true. But the fact that the community weren't taken on that journey, they almost leap to the worst case scenario, and that sort of Orwellian, well, what are you doing with our data kind of concern. And I sort of see that as being a really common interpretation by the community that is not engaged. So I'll say that first. That doesn't mean that is what's happening. That doesn't mean that that's not what's happening. But the fact that they weren't consulted is often one of the biggest challenges. So I would say that in both at the privacy and security side of things, there may or may not actually be issues, but the fact that people haven't provided that information or people haven't been consulted on that information often causes more issues than the problems themselves. And I guess that's just the human factor, right? And it's not knowing what's going on and having concerns which are quite adequate when it's our personal information. So, I'll say that and sort of put that to the side, and privacy by no means is my area of expertise, but it's certainly an observation, particularly in the smart city space. What I would say around the technology choices and how people govern and go about that, look, there's room for improvement. Let's say that. It doesn't always mean it's terrible, but there is a lot of organizations, including government, that are going out and making decisions that aren't necessarily well informed. And there's great examples too. I guess I'm sort of focusing on those where it's not so fantastic. And I think having policy and frameworks and governance and guidelines should be one of the first steps, not buying shiny toys and starting to put them out in the public space and then finding a bunch of problems and trying to deal with the consequences. So I would just say around the process that they go about things, the governance should be upfront, not an afterthought. And I guess that's where the privacy and security by design comes in. So a great example, go on, Lani.
No, after you, Danny.
I was going to say a great example of that is there is a council, and then actually there's probably more than one that's done this, is they've gone and put environmental sensors out with completely benign kind of purpose. They just want to understand local air quality, what's going on. But some of them included light sensors. And an unintended consequence of that is that you could kind of tell when people were home and when they weren't based on the environmental changes. And because that data was publicly available, that's obviously caused some concern, and potentially you could know when to go and burgle someone's house. Now, it's a really extreme example, I suppose, but it's kind of an example where there was no, malicious intent, there was no surveillance intent, but that's what happened, rightly or wrongly. And I guess the reason I say the governance is so important is that there is unintended consequences when we do things we haven't done before. So I would just say that, I think that extra level of care up front can help anticipate and alleviate those concerns rather than doing that retrospectively.
That's really great, actually, and good points, especially around that unintended consequences. I find, particularly in the smart cities use case, that would probably be the most of what I come across in terms of that unintended consequences. And there is an art form too in terms of bringing the community along. I remember back in 2014 when we were implementing or designing a smart city strategy for the local Queensland councils. As with any sort of good management consultants, we sort of went in and with the co-design aspect of designing it with citizens in mind. We held I think it was like 5 sort of public workshops, and I got to say we probably got maybe at most 5 people along to those workshops. So at that stage in 2014, it was very, very difficult to get people to buy into it, because it was like, well, it's a technology project the council's doing. What do I care? Whereas over time, we've sort of honed our approach to that. And in the last project I worked on, which involved it wasn't a local government. It was more of a sort of a property builder, I guess. In terms of like a Lendlease or a Stockland building an estate in the south of Brisbane, and trying to get the community engaged. It was really heartening to see that we'd sort of improved our approach. And what we did was we basically, instead of just making it about the people in terms of what's in it for me, a lot of the work that we did was what's in it for you and your friends and your family who live around you. So went with that sort of community feel. And we were getting 50 to 100 people per over the 4 workshops that we ran. And we mixed that up with social media as well. So we had a lot more engagement. And so there is an art form when you want to bring the community on for a ride, and you don't. There was public councils in the Northern Territory. Actually, I won't name them, but it's public record. It was in the public in terms of CCTV cameras that were being deployed. And again, it was if you looked at what was being deployed and what the council was saying, the technology that we're using was benign. But it just so happened that it was the same vendor that was being used by some of the Chinese cities in terms of their surveillance, etc. So it sort of whipped up a sort of mini hysteria. The media got onto it, etc. So that's probably a good use case to show you what happens when you don't do that well in terms of that community engagement and sort of allaying the fears of the community around things like surveillance.
Yeah, I might just add to that, Lani, like in all of the engagements I think we've had with local government, I think that sort of benign intent, I haven't come across a government department yet who's trying to use that for a purpose other than what people are generally quite happy with. And usually it's driven by public safety or anonymized data to help them better plan cities, being 2 typical examples. Getting on the front foot with that would have made so much of a difference in examples like the one you pointed out. And it often is the case, and as I said, I'm yet to come across one yet where it's not the case. It's mostly been a communications issue and a collaboration issue as opposed to a technology or a privacy issue as such. And I suppose when we get into that, we're really talking obviously facial recognition and data matching and all sorts of things that people don't want to see. And whether the governance and frameworks behind the scenes is in place to stop that from occurring, I guess, is where either people don't have the trust or they don't have the information, and therefore they sort of fill in the blanks. They're the 2 scenarios, we see really often.
I think there's kind of a bit of a cowboy thing that goes on as well. When you talked about shiny toys, I just thought, yes, that's exactly right. It's almost like in some ways particularly our local government, they're a little bit like magpies, right? And they just hone in on the shiny thing and they want to bring it back to their nest. And I think that's wonderful in so many ways. but I wonder about the rigor around that. You know, even if you look at the huge round of smart cities funding that has enabled, you know, our cities all over Australia to gain access to the same kinds of technologies, right? So, you know, we were talking about, you know, one of the Northern Territory cities that got access to CCTV cameras that had facial recognition capability, and that hit the media, and there was a big storm about that. Well, do you know all the other cities that received exactly that same funding got exactly those same cameras? And it makes me think, well, where was the link between privacy, security, and the funding? Who said? Nobody, obviously, that look, these cities need to do their privacy and their cyber homework before they can get access to this funding, that they need to demonstrate some level of capability around communicating properly to the community, around having strong privacy management in place, around having data breach management in place. You know, all of those things that say to me a city's mature enough to deploy technologies of that type. And that didn't happen with that recent round of funding. As a result, what we had was just magpies swooping on the technology, not thinking about what was going to happen when they brought it back to their nest. And some cities were very lucky. They haven't had any community outcry at all. But that's possibly because the community just in those cases aren't alive to the issues that are really relevant for them right now.
Can I ask, are there any state or federal guidelines around implementing security and the standards that need to be adhered, either relating to areas like facial recognition or just basic security measures?
Well, there's certainly laws in place. So you have your federal and state territory privacy laws. There's a couple of states that don't have privacy laws, which is a tiny bit worrying. So Western Australia and South Australia both work on the basis of administrative standards. And actually cities in those states have probably a higher proportion of IoT testing going on, right? Because there isn't that legislative rigor in place in terms of what what the compliance obligations of the cities are. And then there's also your surveillance legislation. So a number of states also have rules around human surveillance that have to be taken into account before they use particular technologies in particular ways. So look, I think what's happening though is that people are deploying the technologies and then they're worrying about the rules later. And I see this certainly as I've spent quite a bit of time in the regulatory space, so working for privacy commissioners where you're observing cities putting in technologies such as this and trying to provide guidance around how to apply the legislation in that case. And usually it's a cart before the horse arrangement, right? Where the technology is deployed before they do the homework about how to get there safely in terms of community privacy or even that security rigor. I can't tell you how many times I have gone into a city to find that they don't even have a basic information security policy, let alone a digital security policy, and they're deploying technologies of this type.
So where does the buck stop then for cities like that? Is there any accountability when it comes down to it?
You'd like to think so, right? I mean, we do have privacy commissioners, we have other review bodies. Even ombudsmen can get involved in decisions that cities might take to deploy technologies if those decisions, could amount to maladministration. There's lots of different ways you can kind of catch cities in that regulatory net. That doesn't tend to happen though. And maybe that's not the appropriate vehicle as well. Sometimes the more appropriate vehicle is holding cities to account through the court of public opinion. Such as in the case of the northern city that we were mentioning, the community was really upset. They felt that they'd been bamboozled, right? They just felt like their trust had been eroded, even though their privacy technically hadn't been. And the amount of work that particular local government had to go to reverse that opinion of them was really extensive, and they've done it. I feel that they've really done a good job of turning things around. But you wouldn't want to be a city in that position, I would think.
And I'd say it probably still lives on in the Facebook forums as well, all these things. And I mean, China has been mentioned, but we can't really talk about CCTV without Chinese potential surveillance. I'm putting everything in quote marks, or even Russian hackers. I mean, it's big news. It's really pushing people's fears, but it does seem like it's a measured and real threat in some ways, and that directly, comes back to people's privacy.
Yeah, and it is like, the government recently, I think it was mid-June, came out on a Friday and made this big public announcement that nation-state attackers had been active in Australia over the last few months, and it got to the stage where they had to come out and make a public sort of announcement, which was kind of alarming. I mean, I stick close to the threat intel, etc., that's made either public or via private feeds. And yes, there was an uptick in a lot of the groups that are that are allied with the the Chinese government. But it was a big announcement, and I think that's really put cyber in the context of nation-state attackers, primarily China. I mean, that's the elephant in the room, right? We don't like to talk about it, but that's who the government, who the Prime Minister was referring to when he spoke about nation-state attackers in Southeast Asia. It was our biggest trading partner, China. So you're right. If you look at that and that sort of heightened funding now that's been sort of diverted to the Australian Signals Directorate to beef up our critical infrastructure, to beef up our sort of national defences, in the context of what we've just been talking about in terms of cities, local governments deploying smart cities type tech, it is becoming a bigger sort of thing that we've got to be concerned about. I wouldn't say overly worried, but there's some cause for concern. I mean, you listen to what Nicole said, which I fully concur with, in terms of cities, if we're talking about that context, will deploy technology ahead of what either their capability is or what regulations or what that they have to follow. It just simply is that is the case, right? So if you put it, nation states into that context, yeah, it is an area for concern both now and in the near future.
Yeah, I guess I guess to build on that, Lani, I guess the other side of it is that obviously there's a number of areas where the government's outright banned certain types of technology because of those concerns. And as Nicole mentioned around, the surveillance sort of legislation, and how there's examples of particularly with microphones and listening to public activity. There's some states and territories that have dealt with that really well. And there's plenty of examples where they have gone and done things that they weren't aware of. And I guess one thing I would note is that, you can't expect every government entity, including, the local governments that don't have the same resources as some of the others. They may or may not have that expertise in-house, but they do have a duty of care and responsibility. And I guess it's difficult for them to even be A, aware of some of these things, and B, find the right guidance and advice, because quite often it's, someone doing their very best, from the IT department or, innovation department or what have you, applying the common sense of what they know, and just not having all that tools and information that they really need. I very rarely see anyone that I think is, deliberately ignoring responsibility, but certainly there is sometimes the wrong people in those roles not aware of some of those responsibilities. I imagine you probably would have similar comment.
Yeah, one of the things that I really encourage our cities to do in particular, never mind other organizations, is to conduct privacy impact assessments. And, a component of that involves information security, right? That the city needs to outline what are the physical and technical and administrative steps that they're taking to secure personal information in particular, right? In the case of privacy impact assessments. But more broadly, that's a really important exercise. The idea that, whether you're a large local government or small, whether you're a large organization or small, whether you're a startup, it doesn't actually matter. You need to do that diligence and go through that approach. And, all of us here would have capability to provide that kind of guidance to a city, and to help them build that internally so that they have that kind of sustainable capacity over time. You know, I like the idea that for any project that involves deploying technology, that a city would have privacy and security representation at the table, and that no technology project should be going ahead without having those representatives have a look at it. And if the city doesn't have the capacity in-house, or whatever the organization is, if they don't have the capacity in-house, they need to bring it in and consider that part of their project budgeting.
I've got a question for you, Nicole. I mean, in terms of the privacy law, right? Am I right in assuming that our national privacy law councils and that are exempt, but they do fall under the state laws?
Yeah, so they have to comply with whatever the privacy rules are in the state or territory that they live in, which is great. The state and territory privacy laws are substantially similar to what you see in our Federal Privacy Act, with the exception of some things like data breach notification isn't something that you see in every state and territory privacy law. And then, of course, we have those couple of rogue states that haven't got around to it yet. And Queensland actually didn't get its privacy law until 2009, which is quite a long time if you consider that the federal law has been in place since 1988. Right? So there's this really kind of long time lag in terms of regulation, but there's still plenty of information and global discourse around privacy and security, and it still risks that our cities, our decision makers, should be alive to, even if they're not required to observe a particular law. There are international rules and standards in relation to both privacy and security that they can apply kind of in a worst case scenario if there isn't legislation that applies to them directly.
And in terms of, I'm working with the council at the moment. One of the questions, and this is a common question I get, is that when it comes to like a privacy impact assessment, my guideline usually for them is it's not like a one shot, you do it once and that's it, right? It's almost like an iterative, continuous improvement type process. But for a council that's already limited in terms of the skills in that space, what's the best way to approach it in terms of setting that baseline when you do your initial assessment, but then making it, continuously being able to improve it?
Well, look, there's a couple of things that they can do for sure. One thing that I work to embed in the councils that I work with is what you call a privacy threshold assessment process, where you have a look at a really high level at your project, and you make doing that assessment part of the project management gateway. Right? So you cannot proceed with project management until you go through that threshold assessment. Just like you can't if you don't do your workplace health and safety assessment, and if you don't do your equal opportunity assessment, and all the various other things that are well embedded in decision making for projects. And if a project involves personal information, collecting it and handling it in some way, that then triggers a privacy impact assessment. But it's through the threshold assessment process that you decide how deep you need to go, right? Some projects are going to be much lower risk than others. And the threshold assessment process helps you work that out. It isn't something, though, that, a project officer in a council can do without a level of training or assistance. So if there's not a privacy officer or a privacy team in that council, and some councils don't have that person, there needs to be someone that they can go to, whether it's a legal officer or an outside expert, or honestly, even just the guidelines that are published on privacy commissioner websites in each state and territory. There does need to be a point of reference for those people if they're going to do that activity properly.
I'm muted. Just on that point, I mean, who owns the data, and are there guidelines as to how that data is treated? I mean, I know we touched on some point, but you've specifically got a service provider providing an infrastructure or systems to create the data, and the data's there. There's risk around how that data is treated, but who owns it and who's ultimately responsible for it?
Are we asking me? Is it about the personal stuff?
Oh, I think you're on mute there, Ross.
Sorry, I was kind of opening up. It was kind of to a follow on from you, Nicole, but it's probably something that everyone will have some understanding of.
Well, I can start. I'll talk about the personal stuff. So the way that I guess the accountability chain works when it comes to privacy is that say if we're talking about a local government or an organization or a small business or whomever is owning the project, whoever's deciding to do the thing, whoever is collecting the personal information in order to do the thing, they're the agency, the organization that's responsible for privacy and security. And it's through their contracts with the different vendors, the different organizations, that they then also require those other players to observe the same kind of privacy and security rigor. Ultimately, though, say in local governments, if something falls down, if something goes wrong, if my privacy is breached, it's my local government that's held to account first. And then they may hold their vendors or particular subcontractors to account if necessary.
Mm. And I mean, and in practice, it's really difficult to get to. I found. I worked on a project back in 2018 where an online retailer here in Australia, quite a large one, had been approached by Facebook in terms of getting into an agreement where they could collaborate on data projects. If this online retailer, and they had a lot of different brands that they had, if they would allow Facebook access to the data, Facebook would enrich it with their data, etc., and they could start building new data products and services off the back of that, improve the the service to their client, give the retailer much more rich information in terms of buying patterns, advertising, etc. So on paper, it looked like a fantastic deal. The board were all for it because it was going to be a good news story and open up new revenue streams for it. So we were brought in not to look at the privacy aspect because they had a chief privacy officer, but to look at more the contractual constructs and around how the data was secured, where it was kept, data jurisdictions, etc. And the whole project fell over in the end because they just could not. They hammered it out for about nearly 6 months in terms of contractual arrangement, data jurisdiction in terms of where the data was kept, the chain of custody, as Nicole would mentioned. And it got so difficult that both parties said, hey, look, maybe right now, the time is not right in terms of where, privacy laws are in different countries and where data centers were located, etc. So it's not an easy thing to do, especially if you're talking to like an overseas player as well.
Oh yeah, even right now, if you think of all of the issues that are coming out of Europe, out of a recent decision there, the Court of Justice in the EU decided on a matter that they call it Schrems 2. So this fellow called Max Schrems made a complaint about Facebook to the Irish Data Protection Commissioner, and through a whole bunch of wheeling and dealing, the complaint ended up back with the European courts. And it was decided that it's not lawful to transfer personal data of EU citizens and store it in the United States. And the reason it's not lawful is because the United States can't demonstrate that they have a robust privacy regime there on which people can rely in the event that they need to make a complaint, and that it's a surveillance state. It's one of those things, right? We don't often think of the United States as a place where surveillance is rife, but in terms of government surveillance of the people through their national security legislation and now the Cloud Act, those are pretty significant things. And we are seeing issues like this pop up all over the world in terms of our relationships with our vendors. And there is a real need during that procurement process to bed down who exactly those vendors are, where they're located, where they store their data, who their subcontractors are, and where their subcontractors store data, right? So you might have a whiz-bang vendor that says, yep, we're gonna store everything, maybe in New Zealand or here in Australia, but then they use subcontractors that do bits with that data, and those guys are based in Uzbekistan, right? If you haven't done your due diligence, you know, the data might walk out the door.
But I think this is a challenge. You know, as one of the things we're nailing with the councils, but with Danny and Lani, who are implementing technology solutions for councils and smarter cities. It wouldn't be too much to say that those people should be asking the vendors, okay, what are you guys doing? So there should be an onus as much on the vendor as the local authority to say, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to protect you. But then I suppose the question's got to be asked in the first place. I mean, how do you guys find people's knowledge around that when you're going into this type of implementation project?
I'm happy to start, Lani, because I'm sure you've got dozens of examples of this. I guess the two common things, well, I see at least, one, it's not always really clear who owns the data. So there's plenty of occasions where people are paying for software that's ultimately owned by the software vendor. So yes, they use it, yes, they have a copy of it, but the data can be taken off and sort of used for other purposes. I think that's one of the more dangerous areas, because then they have no control over what happens at all. And it kind of reminds me a little bit of a master's thesis that I did on privacy and things like flybys and everyday rewards, but that's a totally different kettle of fish. But things like saying we own your data and we or any of our third parties can use it essentially translates to me as you've got no control of what's happening, and you've just authorized that. So I think there's two parts. I think one is the frameworks around consuming and using products. And of course, plenty of vendors have data centers all over the world, and we need to be really clear about where they're going, where even the backups go. So not just so much the actual data where I use it. Yes, it's hosted in Australia. Yes, it's it's in Sydney and I know exactly where it is. But then the copies of that, quite quickly, as Nicole sort of put it, walks out the door, and it it can end up in places that you hadn't anticipated. So I would say definitely that there has to be a level of responsibility. I wouldn't leave that just to asking vendors for the answers to your questions, because quite often they'll give you an answer, but it's half of the answer. And it's only when you ask very pointy, specific questions about, data ownership, data locations, data backups, replication, those sorts of things that you really get to the truth. And I don't think there's a huge amount of transparency there. So I think there's quite a number of dangers, and I don't think most organizations are well equipped to know what to ask. So I think that, the three of us obviously see this quite often, but, it's something that I don't think is particularly well known. And in the procurements that I have seen from government, they ask some of the right questions, but they probably don't ask enough of those right questions. Yeah. So, I regularly have some concerns around that.
Yeah, no, I would agree with what Danny said, and I'd probably highlight too where and this is not just councils, but where organisations that I've worked with struggle is when they look at the risk in their supply chain. So if you think about the privacy issues, the cybersecurity issues we've been talking about, imagine if your vendor then subcontracted part of that to a third party who subcontracted that to another party, etc., and that risk in terms of that chain becomes much more complex as you try and sort of quantify the risk and apply sort of controls to mitigate that. And the example the most recent example I had is working with a property development. They were more of a property, not a construction, but more of a property management. And they had a lot of their, control centers in that sort of monitored a lot of the CCTV, monitored data devices in that from the shopping centers that they operated. A lot of it was third party to organizations that were offshore, Philippines, India. And so when we did an assessment of their, so we had people actually overseas to visit the actual offices, the privacy practices in those, third parties were extremely poor, right? Where they would have desk, sort of sharing, and then people would be leaving documents in that from their previous, client that they were working with on their desks. So that sort of supply chain risk is really, really difficult to sort of secure and to get a view of. And the other thing I guess I'd talk about when you talk about ownership of data is we're moving into the era of now data exchange and data monetization. So, there's a number of platforms in the market where, you pay to upload or sort of distribute the data that you have from sensors that you have deployed around the place. And then you trade it in terms of, you build a new data product, using something like an app store sort of, concept, and you build a new product, and whoever the data you've taken and sort of used gets, clipped along the way. So that, in terms of who owns the data, who's responsible for it, becomes a little bit murkier unless the vendor who's sort of hosting that service has really good controls and good contractual controls around who owns the data and what you can do with it.
I think there's also an issue of understanding that your vendors often are just looking out for, their own selves. So I have a client actually that I'm working with now that's looking into, beefing up their security, which I'm really happy about. But this didn't really come up for them until I raised, well, how are you assessing for vulnerabilities? So they have, there's an infrastructure as a service product that they're offering that they're taking advantage of, my client. And they said, well, the vendor does this sort of automated testing. And I said, oh yeah, well, where does the testing originate? Who does it? Oh, a subcontractor in India. And I said, oh, okay, well, is it does somebody sit there and push a button, or is it just a program that kind of runs behind the scenes? Well, it's just a program that runs behind the scenes that does this automated vulnerability testing. And I asked, well, what are they testing for? Well, they're testing for known vulnerabilities in their own product. So they're not actually testing for the full suite of vulnerabilities and having a look to see where actual risks are and where, all the holes need to be plugged. They're just looking to plug the holes in their own product, right? To cover, their own backside. That is not enough from a security perspective, never mind a privacy perspective, if the data that's in question is personal. So these are the kinds of things that I come up against, and it doesn't matter what the technology is, right? Whether it's, or even what it is you're storing, right? What kind of data it is. It can be entirely financial data. It can be data that appears to be non-personal, but in fact is, highly identifying, something like location data, for example. That combined with one other piece of data could, identify a person as they move through their life very easily. So these are the kinds of things that I look at, and this is exactly where privacy and security, I think, have a really beautiful intersection. And I think you can't talk about one without the other. In terms of security, you can definitely, you can have security without having privacy, I would say, but you can't have privacy at all without that security component being covered off. And so, when I'm dealing with clients or I'm providing information sessions, I always try to make that causal link. And that example of, a vendor doing their own vulnerability assessments for their own stuff, they're not actually taking care of you in the context of the contract. They're taking care of themselves.
Mm. Mm. And that's common, right? I mean, even if you look at cloud service providers like Microsoft, AWS, Google, if you look at their contract clauses, all their security is for the platform, but you yourself as a client still need to maintain, security for your data that's hosted, your instances that are hosted in those services.
Mm.
I suppose that.
Sorry, Ross. I was just going to add, I guess even with all the right frameworks and things in place, the other thing that often gets forgotten is who has access to that data. So not so much who owns it, not so much how vulnerable is it, but like who actually has access. And that's something that very rarely gets asked.
Yeah, it's not something we design for very well, I don't think, Danny. I think that's, that's usually the question that gets asked after the horse has bolted and, there has been some kind of a data breach or an interference with privacy. That's when the question is, well, who had access to this? And, how could you let that happen?
Yeah. And it goes back to that supply chain, third-party risk, right? Because, and I'll use the use case I talked about previously. The company was a BPO organization that was based in India. And so one analyst that you would have working would be working multiple clients, right? 3 or 4 clients. And in terms of how that data was handled, it was just complete mismatch, in terms of where it was stored, hard physical data that was left on the desks, etc. So yeah, absolutely. And it's something that, as you said, it's something I find doesn't come up until the auditors start coming in and having a look, and then and uncover that.
Yeah, well, about that time where we're all scratching our heads wondering how something happened, and start asking questions that probably should have been asked some time ago.
You know how we talked earlier, and Danny, you mentioned about privacy by design and security by design and how important those two things are. For me, I think some of these issues can be worked out if we actually just have the conversations ahead of time. Yep. Before we have finished building the thing, or before we buy the tech, or before we deploy the tech, have the conversations to design for the outcomes that we want. So if we are concerned about citizen privacy, or we are concerned about instances of data breach, relating to unauthorized access, whatever it is we're concerned about, getting that down up front and working to remove that as a risk before we actually go through the deployment exercise. I think that that's just so much better, but it's more time consuming. It does actually force us to think about the decisions we're making and why. And that's not really a comfortable place for leadership necessarily, right? They often want the shiny tech to be deployed. They want to be first. I see this in the case of cities all the time. The competitiveness is insane. Yeah. But the good decision making lags behind sometimes when it comes to how we deploy those technologies.
Also, I think it goes to perception. I think Danny, sorry, I can't remember Danny or Nicole mentioned, because people perceive financial data is essential, it has to be bulletproof, looked after. People perceive vulnerability assessments for websites. I mean, we've seen security breaches there. Again, it needs to be bulletproof, but there seems to be a lack from what you guys have said of the perception of importance in privacy data. I mean, I've seen anecdotal reports around people being able to break into certain IoT technologies and get wider, but the discussion's always there about the wider security breach, that they could get a backdoor into a system and create havoc. But there seems to be less importance of personal data and what's being done with it. But maybe that's because, well, I don't know the reasons why, but as we look at more, it seems to be more almost about inconvenience. People don't necessarily want to be watched going down the streets or their habits, but when we come to facial recognition and the kind of Orwellian kind of tunnel that you can go down around these things, then maybe that importance will be raised.
Just briefly, because I know, Nicole, you've probably got the most, I guess, to contribute here, but I think it's broadly accepted that financial data, health data, that's really important. And sometimes even like people's names and addresses, that's kind of quite generally understood. Where I think it gets grey is that people don't understand some of the newer technology and what data is actually being collected in the first place to properly understand and assess that risk. But the other point I guess I wanted to point out is that we treat cybersecurity, and we treat privacy like they're not like any other organizational risk. Like, it's not like organizations leave the front door unlocked, like especially around physical security, people generally do a pretty good job of that. But it's almost like it's just kind of out of sight, out of mind when it comes to both cyber and privacy. And I do wonder if it's because they can't physically see it. So I don't know, Lani and Nicole, if you've got things to add there, but that's just my observation of it.
Yeah, I would agree, Danny. And it's a fight that we've been fighting in the cyberspace for a long, long time. I think we're just sort of making real sort of impact. And especially like if you look at the cyber strategy the Australian government just released, where they're looking to make board directors accountable now, in law, right? So, and I think that will help a lot. But you are right. It's because it's hard to quantify, put it that way. And I find that organizations with strong OH&S practices, mining, anything to do with sort of physical safety, usually have a better sort of grasp on cyber risk as well.
It's probably because they have a grasp on the outcome. right? In that OH&S context, the outcome could be death.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But not recognizing that if there's a cyber breach, you know, say of an air conditioning system in a hospital, or, you know, if the oxygen flow is turned off by some baddie, there's going to be death there as well. But we don't think about that as the natural consequence of, you know, cyber attack. We often think more the financial consequence, right? You'd see your denial of service attacks or whatever. You think of, well, how's that going to disrupt my business, and am I going to have to pay somebody to, you know, have this problem undone? Now, but I really like the way that this conversation is going, because the idea of accountability, the idea of responsibility, I don't actually feel that sits with the community, right? I don't think it's the community's job to understand, you know, really what the cyber risks are associated with dealing with an organization, or that they should be accountable for their own privacy actions. And I think that the idea that in the cybersecurity strategy, you know, while I have views on it, I think that the idea that there's that additional accountability, that requirement for additional training and awareness, and those things are really super important in terms of building an organization's capacity to deal with cyber, and then by extension privacy issues.
So we've covered off a couple of topics. I don't want to bring things to a close. I'm sure that there's a lot more to talk about too quickly, but I think there's probably some areas to pick up going forward. But where we're at now, I mean, how do we see this maturing? Is there an easy fix for everything? Because there's different maturities within councils, within private bodies as well. I mean, do we need an ASIC type regulatory body on top of that? Is it realistic? What are your views, just quickly, to kind of close this off?
I think the different sectors are acting. Like if you look at the power sector, that recently AEMO, who's the regulator in that, have brought in a framework, a cyber framework called AES CSF. So, you know, the financial services regulator, APRA, already has one. So I think you find that the different sectors, the water sector is looking to build one at the moment. So I think you'll find the different sectors will get into that. And then, you know, from a government perspective, the government definitely is moving in that direction in terms of, you know, the latest strategy. The two things that stood out for me is within critical infrastructure, the government will actually intervene if there is a breach, in terms of, you know, critical infrastructure operators will need to report up to the government, usually probably via the ACSC, and then they will be able to intervene to help out. And the second one is boards becoming actually accountable legally for cybersecurity. So I think we're heading, from a regulatory perspective, we are heading in the right direction. You know, but given the fact that regulations normally move a lot slower than innovation, right, and technology in general.
Okay, well, thanks, guys. I think we need to wrap up now. Look, thanks very much for your time, everyone. Nicole, Danny, and Lani. Thanks to the viewers as well for watching us.